It's the top of the hour. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's GlomCon session. I'm Dia Wagasback in Houston, Texas. Today we are continuing our clinical trial conference series, a joint venture between GlomCon and NephCure. We're very excited today for this discussion. Our topic is disparities in clinical research. So I will introduce now our speaker and moderator, and later on in the talk, you'll meet our panelists. Our speaker today is Dr. Deidra Cruz. She's the professor of medicine in the Division of Nephrology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. She's the associate director for research development at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Equity and the founding director of the Doctoral Diversity Program there. Her research program aims to advance equity in kidney disease and hypertension outcomes by focusing on the social drivers of health inequities. She has received numerous awards for her research contributions, and she holds many national leadership positions, including on both the American Society of Nephrology and the American Board of Internal Medicine. And we're very excited to have her share her knowledge and her contributions today and participate in this very important discussion. Our moderator today is Dr. John Kevin Tucker. He's an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the section chief of nephrology at Brigham and Women's Faulkner Hospital. He's the vice president of education at Mass General Brigham's and the former program director of the Combined Nephrology Fellowship at Brigham and Beth Israel. He's a director of the Master in Clinical Services Operations program, and he's a recipient of numerous teaching awards. And we're thankful for his contributions today, as well as his help in organizing this session. So before I turn it over to Dr. Cruz, just a little bit about NephCure. The NephCure's mission is to accelerate research for effective treatments in rare forms of nephrotic syndrome and provide education and support to improve the lives of those affected by protein-spilling kidney diseases. And a reminder, NephCure, one resource they have is the Kidney Health Gateway. There's a physician portal, and there's also a portal where patients, family members, or researchers can access to find ongoing trials and connect them to certain support and trials that are going on to better help us advance our treatment of our patients and family members and friends with kidney disease.
Great, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm going to try to start sharing my screen here. Okay, great.
Yes, perfect.
So wonderful. So I am really most excited today about the opportunity for the discussion that I'm hoping that we're gonna be able to have here in a few moments, but thought that I would try to frame the discussion by helping us think about disparities in clinical research pretty broadly and thinking about why they may exist, and then with some, at least of my ideas around what we can do about these reasons that we see disparities in clinical research. And so when we look at clinical research in kidney diseases in specific, what we know is that disparities abound. There are disparities in funding, excuse me, for kidney disease relative to other conditions. When you look here at the bottom of this slide, this was a report by Zakkali and colleagues who highlighted that while we see across the world that there's a significant prevalence of kidney disease with a worldwide burden of 9% of individuals in the world having kidney disease, and kidney disease being a leading cause of death across the world. In fact, by 2040, CKD is expected to be the 5th highest cause of death in the world population. What we see is that the WHO, the World Health Organization, hasn't established specific goals around limiting this CKD epidemic in the world. And what we see when we look in the United States specifically is that the investment in research for kidney disease really does lag behind what we see in terms of investment in other conditions such as cardiovascular disease, where we see cardiovascular disease and cancer for that matter. And so what we see is that in 2019, around $11 billion were spent in research, invested in research for cancer, about $5 billion in cardiovascular disease, but only $680 million when it comes to kidney diseases. And so there is a disparity, if you will, in terms of the funding that's even available for this type of work. And then important to our discussion today despite there being quite profound racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic disparities in kidney disease, only by my count in looking at the National Institutes of Health reporter system, only around 25 of the current studies that are funded through the National Institute for Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Diseases actually address disparities. And that was just by searching for the keyword disparities across those studies. And this is despite there being hundreds of studies on kidney disease currently funded by this institute. And so, again, really disparities in just the focus of this of this issue when it comes to funding. There are also disparities in funding of investigators. And so by this, what I'm referring to is that racial and ethnic minority investigators are also less likely to receive funding for research when it comes to, for example, the National Institutes of Health. And so, and this is important because it's been shown that particularly Black investigators, Hispanic investigators as well, are more likely to conduct research that is addressing disparities in a number of different diseases, including we see this in kidney disease as well. And so it becomes important that those individuals receive support for their work. And in this report that just came out in Cell just last month, what they looked at there in column A was that there continues to be a gap in terms of the number of funded applications that come from white investigators as compared to those that come from Black investigators, almost a twofold difference. And this is, excuse me, this is even when accounting for factors that we know can lead investigators to be more likely to be successful in their applications, including whether the institution that they're coming from has a track record for supporting research. It includes the success in terms of publications and other factors of those investigators. Even when accounting for those things, there are still these disparities in funding that we see, again, by race. And in this article, Dr. Stevens and colleagues really highlighted that in this time when there's a lot of focus on social justice, including racial justice, that there's an opportunity for the National Institutes of Health to actually look at the review process. And you can see in this figure here in panel B, that when we look on the left-hand side of that panel at the current state, where the review process actually tends to be the place where it's thought that this racial disparity in funding tends to arrive, that there are opportunities here on the right-hand panel to actually have to achieve more equity in the funding process by addressing the reviewers really in the review process, and that this ultimately can lead us to greater innovation and creativity in our work and in discovery. And we know that by having a more inclusive set of investigators, we actually can then work more meaningfully towards reducing disparities across a number of different health conditions, and we would imagine this would be the case in kidney disease. And in order to do this, these authors highlight it would actually cost very little in terms of the overall NIH budget to actually institute these equity policies. And so just want to highlight that there are also disparities in this issue of funding of investigators. And then turning to what I think is going to be the major focus of our time together today, which is really thinking about disparities in kidney research participation. And this is when we think about actually who among people with or at risk for kidney diseases are actually participating in research. And what I'd like for us to think about is what the root causes of this these disparities that we see in terms of participation in research might be. And here in particular, thinking about for socially marginalized populations, including racial and ethnic minorities, people with socioeconomic disadvantage as well, and the limited participation that we see among those individuals, or their limited inclusion in research studies. And so The first thing I think that's important to note is that in order for a person to really even find out that they have kidney disease, they have to have be engaged in healthcare and actually have access to primary care, for example. And we know in the United States and even across the world in many settings that there are inequities in access to primary care that are experienced by racial and ethnic minorities, and also people with low incomes, for example. And so we also know that there are inequities in terms of the detection of kidney disease for many of these populations, meaning that even if they are in care, such as in primary care, they may not have undergone both blood and urine testing to actually determine that they have kidney disease, and that diagnosis may not have been communicated to those individuals. We've seen this reported in the literature. And then from there, turning to inequities that we see in terms of referrals to nephrology. So in order for a person to find out about the latest treatments that are available, particularly in kidney disease, they are often going to need to be seen by a nephrologist. And we see tremendous, particularly racial and ethnic disparities in timely referral to nephrology care. What we see too often is that Black individuals, Hispanic individuals, and others are referred when their kidney disease is quite advanced. And this is at a time when, for many of them, we are needing to prepare those people for the start of kidney replacement therapy, such as with dialysis. And we don't have as much time to think about referring them to join a clinical trial, for example, where they may be able to receive a therapy that actually could slow their disease progression. And then turning to the middle panel here, where we see that when we think about participation in research, there are numerous barriers to accessing clinical studies, including some of those highlighted here in these figures, where we see trouble with transportation to get to the clinical site or the research site for the study. We see barriers in terms of getting the information about the research studies. We know that there is a great digital divide that exists where where in some communities they don't have access to broadband, and they don't have a computer, for example, where they may not be able, therefore may not be able to look up these different opportunities with respect to joining a clinical research study. And then we know that even getting to these types of studies can be a barrier for people who may have physical limitations or have disabilities, and we do see a disproportionate burden of those types of problems among socially marginalized groups. And then finally, there are often competing responsibilities. We know that racial and ethnic minorities in the United States, for example, are overrepresented among low-wage earners and often don't have access to childcare services, so that those individuals may have to balance being able to participate in a research study and also taking care of the children that they may be caring for, or the elders that they may be caring for in their home. And so those are the types of things that may serve as barriers to research participation. And then on the far right here, there certainly is there can be limited information and knowledge about these different available treatments, and also just the fact that there is research ongoing to try to address kidney disease, for example. And this type of information does not always find its way to some of the most vulnerable communities. And it also is not always delivered in a way that is understandable and addresses the fact that some of these communities may, for example, have a limited English proficiency. And so there are challenges there. And then finally, there is the challenge of fear, of unfair treatment and exploitation by institutions. And I use this word fear here to try to reframe what I think is, particularly in the lay press of late, around this idea of mistrust that we have seen talked about, particularly with respect to the COVID-19 vaccines and concerns about a number of communities being hesitant about receiving the vaccine. And there has also really, I think, for a long time in medicine and in research been this dogma that racial and ethnic minorities don't trust the healthcare system. But I think important to realize this is due to fear, and the fear is of unfair treatment and exploitation. And that fear is rooted both in historical accounts and experiences that have been documented of for example, Black Americans and their treatment in clinical research studies, but also it's due to present day experiences that individuals have had when they've been intersecting with the healthcare system and also with other institutions in our broader society where they have not received fair treatment. And so there can be this fear then when an individual is thinking about potentially joining a research study, that this will be yet another place where they may be treated unfairly and may be exploited. And so these are all barriers and potential root causes for why we see disparities in terms of kidney research participation. And so when we think about some potential approaches to enhancing inclusion of these socially marginalized groups, specifically in kidney research, I'll highlight some potential avenues here by lining them up with those barriers that we spoke about in the previous slides. When we think about fear of this unfair treatment, what can be done is to include these groups, these communities in the early and the formative phases of protocol development for a study. What happens too often in research studies that are conducted is that the entire plan is put together, the funding is received, and then a recruitment plan is put together. And at that point, individuals from, for example, racial and ethnic or socioeconomic disadvantaged communities are invited to participate, but they weren't invited to be involved in putting the protocol together to begin with. And so this is one approach to basically being really transparent about what the process is, and also inviting participation from these individuals really to help shape the protocol in a way that is going to be acceptable and one that can be trusted by these communities that are being invited to join the study. It's important, and one potential approach is to invite partnership as opposed to sort of this more transactional relationship where we reach out to and say, please join the study, rather inviting those groups to really be equal partners in the research process. Transparency is really key, and including study members with whom the participants that we're outreaching to may share identities. So if the target community that we are seeking to recruit for a study it includes Hispanic individuals, for example, having representation of such individuals among the team can be one approach to really reducing this fear. And then when we think about inequities in primary and nephrology care, other avenues can be used for recruitment, including community screenings or via social media. Because there are individuals who will not actually even know that they have this diagnosis that we may be really targeting them for clinical research, providing diagnostic information as part of the study screening can be one benefit to those participants and could help to overcome some of that gap in terms of detection of disease that may be there for these socially marginalized groups. And then as far as barriers to accessing these clinical studies and these competing responsibilities, we can provide transportation, parking, for example, at the clinical research sites. Multiple different means for accessing the information can also be provided. So to include certainly web-based information, but also through advertising this in community settings, places where the populations that we're looking to recruit may be based, right? And sort of taking that information to them. And we can also offer multiple different ways to actually access the intervention itself as part of the studies. And then offering flexible hours for study visits is really key to sort of overcoming some of these competing responsibilities that people have. And then the issue of limited information or knowledge about these available treatments. It's so important to ensure that materials are suitable for people who have low health literacy and or who have limited English proficiency, and that we really partner with trusted community members and organizations to outreach to the groups that we may be looking to recruit, and that we also leverage peer networks. So individuals who also, for example, have kidney disease, who have participated in these types of studies, who can actually help to share information with others who might be interested in participating. And so just to share how this sort of shows up in practice, we currently are conducting a clinical trial called the 5+ Nuts and Beans for Kidneys trial, which is a dietary intervention study for 150 low-income African-American individuals who have both high blood pressure and they have albuminuria, or protein in their urine. And what we're doing in the study is we're testing whether delivering nutritional advice to adopt a healthy way of eating, the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, dietary pattern, plus $30 a week worth of potassium-rich foods, mostly fruits, vegetables, nuts, and beans, will ultimately lead to an improvement or reduction in the amount of protein being lost in the urine, and also improvement in blood pressure. And so ours is a community-based participatory research study. So we have numerous partners and stakeholders that we work with and that have been engaged with us really from the outset of the study. In our approach, I'll just give you some examples to addressing some of these barriers that I highlighted a moment ago, include when we think about this issue of fear, we have a very active community advisory board that has been engaged with us since the initial preparation of the grant submission that went to the National Institutes of Health. They worked with us on developing the protocol and also partner with us throughout the conduct of the study around really addressing different barriers to recruitment, making sure we're engaging participants in a meaningful way, and they will be our partners when we are prepared to disseminate the findings of the study. We send communications, holiday cards, even information about COVID to our participants to sort of keep them engaged through the study, to make sure that they understand that we are really looking to not only kind of get the answer to our research question, but are also interested in their overall well-being, which does engender trust and reduce fear. We have several team members that are African-American investigators, as well as staff that are part of our team, which again, for this study, which is only including African-American participants. When it comes to these inequities in primary and nephrology care, we are recruiting from primary care clinics that predominantly serve low-income patients. In many cases, we found that our participants actually didn't know that they had chronic kidney disease, and so we've actually had to incorporate information just about the CKD diagnosis during our screening processes. We try to address these issues surrounding competing responsibilities and sort of barriers to getting to our study by providing transportation to the study visits for those that need it. And also we conduct home delivery for the foods that are included in this study. And we offer flexible hours for the study visits and the calls that we make as part of the study. And then finally, with respect to this issue of limited information, our community advisory board members had advised us to actually provide testimonials or from participants that have completed our whole study to those who are considering joining it. And so that has, including pictures and really to show that this has been a study that those individuals have enjoyed. And we've actually found that that's been very helpful in continued recruitment in the study. And we also do provide this information about really the role of diet in helping to slow kidney disease progression and community resources around accessing healthy foods. And so to wrap up here, when we think about opportunities, and I know we'll talk more about this, but for policymakers and funders in this space, there's certainly a need to increase support for studies that are addressing disparities in kidney disease. Increased support is needed for investigators who share identities with communities that are experiencing the most disparate burden of kidney disease, as those are the investigators, the researchers who are most likely to actually go on and conduct these types of studies. That is well established. It's also, there are also opportunities to provide guidance on best practices for engaging these socially marginalized communities in research. And there is a need, and something that policymakers and funders can facilitate, there's a need for further training in and also conduct of community-based participatory research. And so to summarize, there are certainly numerous disparities in clinical research. Examining the root causes of these disparities really can help us point to opportunities for enhancing inclusion of socially marginalized groups, and community-based participatory research principles of involving partners in all aspects of the research process may have particular application in kidney disease studies. And so I will end here, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cruz. That was a fantastic presentation. And I will first let me say thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this very important conversation. And I have the privilege of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Barbara Gillespie. Dr. Gillespie is a board certified nephrologist. She completed her residency in internal medicine at UNC and her nephrology fellowship at Duke University Medical Center. So this time of year is probably, I would guess, pretty important for her since it's basketball season. She's currently vice president at Covance Global CRO, where she's the therapeutic head of nephrology and will continue to support sponsors on CKD drug and renal device development. She's also an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina in the Division of Nephrology and Hypertension. And in addition, she's the associate medical director of a small local dialysis unit. So Dr. Gillespie, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. And just want to make sure everyone can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. So March Madness is usually pretty crazy, but with Duke and UNC both being out, I wish the other teams luck. Okay, so greetings everyone from North Carolina. And Dr. Cruz, thank you. Every time I hear you speak, I get more inspired, and you gave a very practical list of things to do, because a lot of these conversations end up being about what the problem is and restating it in several different ways. But you as a researcher yourself and giving that list, those slides on the right, I just want to be able to share that, not just with this group, but all PIs doing non-glomerular disease studies, in addition to the other stakeholders like our sponsors. And so right off the bat, I just want to say, for those of you on the phone who participate in clinical research and you're talking to sponsors as KOLs and designing their studies, please give that list of what they can do directly to sponsors, because they're looking for it. And that's because this is something that matters to the FDA as well. And that's the perspective I'm going to start with here. Well, actually, I'm going to backtrack, because I just want to remind everyone of the federal definitions of race and ethnicity. And this was defined a few years ago by the OMB. And I do this because I find that people sometimes use these terms race and ethnicity interchangeably, and it's a little bit different. As you can see, the races are listed there on the left, 1 through 5. And then on the right, there's basically 2 groups of ethnicity, Hispanic or Latino, or not the above. And so when I read these definitions, you know, my parents are from the Philippines. I was born here in the States. And and my kids asked me the same thing. Should we be describing ourselves as number 2, as Asian or as a Pacific Islander? The other thing I found surprising is there are very specific countries listed here. And I don't know if people are all aware of this, because when you get a form to fill out, whether it's a school form or for medical and clinical research, we don't always have this complete definition with all the countries listed. But I was surprised to see here that under white, Middle Eastern people are expected to classify themselves as white. And when I Googled this, I found an article in the LA Times entitled, "Are Arabs and Iranians White? Census Says Yes." This is what's used for our census in the country, but many disagree. And a woman of Iranian heritage said she has to choose white or other, and other is actually not listed here, but she feels that erases her community. And so, you know, it's important to remember that race is a social construct and not just a biological factor. So we need to do a better job overall of tracking the social determinants that follow what really are arbitrary definitions of race. And I'm quoting there my colleague at UNC, Keisha Gibson. And so I just want folks to keep this in mind. It's not so straightforward for many of us who fill out these forms. Okay, so the next slide here, I'm gonna now talk about the fact that another stakeholder, obviously in clinical research, you know, Deidra mentioned her research funded by the NIH. Well, diversity matters to the FDA too. Of course it should. And I wanted to make everyone aware of this document that was finalized in November of 2020, and it's called Enhancing the Diversity of Clinical Trial Populations, Eligibility Criteria, Enrollment Practices, and Trial Designs. And so, you know, this is a wonderful guidance document because you're hearing the FDA's voice in restating the issue, why they need data in the people who are supposed to benefit from the very drugs and devices we're studying. But the third part of the document is actually a very practical list of, similar to what Dr. Cruz had presented, list of what sponsors should be doing. And a lot of this I kind of consider grassroots stuff. You know, a lot of the stuff that Dr. Cruz is doing in her research, it's called the community-based, a community-based approach, and that's what really needs to happen on the trials. So even the sponsor, even the trials that are sponsored and funded by pharmaceutical companies, even though they can be big in larger numbers and, you know, all over the states and even globally, we still have to encourage investigators and regions to say, you know, what other resources can we use that are based in the community? You need to meet people where they are. And so we had a great conversation about this document back in January. The KHI sponsored a town hall, and a few of my speakers included a woman from the Office of Minority Health in the FDA, as well as a vendor and a CRO who has participated in lupus nephritis and FSGS specifically with the goal of enrolling minority patients. And when you hear Dr. Garrick speak, you hear a lot of same things. You know, he's got a Rolodex in major cities of Black-owned churches and restaurants and other community-based services, and that's where they were going to find patients. And again, it's as Dr. Cruz said, it's not just, you know, hey, join this study, but it's engendering trust and eliminating that fear and educating them of what their disease is and why it's actually specific to your race, and really building those relationships so they do become our partners and they do feel like partners. The next couple of slides are just kind of drive-by slides, because if you go to the FDA website and go to the Office of Minority Health, there are so many resources out there that they have that are wonderful. I just don't know that people are aware of these resources. When I say people, again, stakeholders and clinical researchers, sponsors, trialists, investigators, patients. And so, you know, everyone's busy in clinic and they may not necessarily have the time to go through all of this stuff, but even just telling the patient, you know, consider a clinical trial, consider this website, because what I love about this website, I'm just going to go right to a lot of resources here, but there's a couple of videos that they've posted and they're 25 seconds long. So in this day and age of quick media and everyone's running around, 25 seconds. And this one in particular, Shirley did a couple videos of why diversity matters. And let me try to, I don't know if my screen is blacked here, but you know, in making better medical products. And again, the FDA guidance document talks about what seems obvious to most of us, but again, if we're studying certain groups, we need to include those patients so we have data on those groups to really understand safety and efficacy. I want to mention this workshop, collaborating to advance health equity for diabetes and chronic kidney disease. So this occurred in in February last month, and it's just on my to-do list to go back and see what things have been produced from that meeting. Okay, so why do we care in nephrology? Well, if you think about the last 2-3 years, there have been a wonderful slew of publications of positive trials, not trials that ended negatively, not trials that had to stop early because of safety issues, but positive trials. And they're listed here down, you know, and really, I think all the publications were 2020 and Credence came out in maybe mid-2019 as well as Sonar. But if you look at the baseline table, the characteristics that describe the population and look at the races involved, the majority of these trials, I mean, whites were represented pretty well across all these trials, but look at the red line where Blacks were really underrepresented. I mean, this is really low. Asians are represented a little bit higher, and that represents the countries they went to. But if you think about lupus nephritis, this belimumab trial that was published in New England Journal in September 2020, when you think of your patients of who have lupus nephritis, you know who they are. They are people of color. And, I was part of this trial very early on. This took a really long time to do. And very early on, there was a very strong mandate. FDA is not going to require from a legal standpoint, but there's a very strong mandate to recruit at least 20 to 25% African Americans. And despite from day zero, the planning that went into choosing the particular cities, only 13% of the population was African American. So we need to do better. And why? Well, because this is data from the ALMS lupus nephritis study that was several years ago. And before I forget, I want to credit Dr. Kirk Campbell, who's this slide and the previous were his. He was one of my speakers at the KHI webinar. But here you can see that while there was a similar response in the ALMS trial to both MMF and cyclophosphamide overall, Black and Latino patients had a superior response to MMF. And I forgot when, ALMS was published over a decade ago, but that obviously shaped our treatments and guide our treatments. When we treat lupus nephritis, we're looking at race because we know from this data that Blacks and Latinos did better with MMF. Okay, so this is a great perspective piece written by folks at the FDA. Lisa Thompson is a nephrologist there. And so this is something we talk about at the KHI. Just simply reading the underlined in red, it feels obvious, but we're not implementing this as well as we should. So difference in responses to treatments have been observed in African Americans, highlighting the importance of studying medical products in this population. Recent advances in understanding the genetic contributions to disease progression in African Americans, including the discovery of risk variants in the APOL1L1 gene, raise the possibility of using genetic information to better tailor treatments for African Americans. So this is a really great opportunistic moment. And I use the word opportunistic because the discoveries and the advances for APOL1 kidney disease, it happens to target African Americans. And I think this is our chance to say, and now we're talking also about precision medicine to say, hey, we specifically really need to want to study you because we have things that can help your diseases. And when we talk about APOL1 genetic variants here on the right, I should have started, but you all, I think, are aware of this. Found only people with African or Caribbean ancestry accounts for 70% of non-diabetic kidney failure, 70%. And increased rates of FSGS, hypertensive kidney disease, and HIV nephropathy. And so variance causes kidney failure in 4 out of 10 African Americans who are on dialysis. And so again, there are other examples in this piece where they look at therapies where there was differential responses based on your race. But just back to the African American population, again, many of you know this, 13% of the US population, but they make up 35, and I've heard up to 40% of our dialysis population. However, when you look at participation in clinical trials, only 5%. And so that discrepancy is just not acceptable. However, when you do set out specifically to recruit minorities in a study, you can achieve more diverse enrollment. I brought up the lupus nephritis, the BLISS trial on the other slide, and we did get 13, they did get 13%, so better than in the past. But look at the SPRINT blood pressure study. They actually enrolled 31% of African Americans. So this is possible. We just need to be thinking about it on day zero and implementing some of the things that Dr. Cruz had talked about. Okay, so I know we've got 2 patients here, and I definitely want to make sure we include them in the discussion, but I just want to quickly point out for glomerular disease, the KDIGO guidelines have not been published yet, but Dr. Barrett was okay with me sharing this. There has been a culture shift in nephrology to embrace trial participation as an option for clinical care. And in my mind, as Dr. Cruz had said, there are inequities to access to medical care, both to primary care and kidney doctors. But once patients do come to see us, and if we can make clinical trials easier for everyone, well, our guidelines are now saying to consider trials as an option for care, because as you know, when you're part of a trial, things you can get standard of care treatment that's, you know, on the trials time, which is great. So Chapter 1 in this KDIGO, patients with GN should be offered participation in a registry or clinical trial whenever available. So general across all GN, but even more focused in IgA nephropathy, the chapter there, if you look at the treatment algorithm, if patients have sustained proteinuria, we start them on ACE, ARB, and supportive therapy. But now in the past, the next step was to consider steroids, but look at this new box, consider enrollment in a clinical trial. And so here on the left, we all know the profile of IgA nephropathy. Those trials we largely do in Asia because a lot of Asian Americans are affected. But I found this from a cancer patient paper. Asian Americans are the fastest growing minority group in the US, yet the least represented in clinical trials. So you know, we have to think about our diseases and match our diseases to the patients who will benefit from the trials we're doing. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Gillespie, for that presentation. And we will turn now to our patients whom we have as part of our distinguished panel. The voice of the patient is very important. And so I want to first introduce Ellen Owusu. Ms. Owusu is out in Springfield, which is a little bit west of me here in Boston. And I want her to, Ellen, if you would, Ms. Owusu, just tell us briefly about your kidney disease story.
Hi, I'm Ellen. Like you said, I'm from Springfield, Massachusetts. I back into 2019, after a couple of doctor's appointments, I did some blood work and they found out that I had some proteins in my urine. So, you know, I'm new to this, so, you know, I'm learning as I go. So yeah, so they did a biopsy, found out that I have FSGS. So then the doctor tried with steroids, prednisone, didn't work. So he said, you know, first he told me, oh, I'm treating clients that have it. Then he tells me I'm not, so I'm not sure. So right now I'm in the process of looking for a doctor to see if I can, because right now my GFR is going really quickly. It's going low quickly. So he only got me on blood pressure medicine. So there's nothing he's doing for me. I just feel like he gave up on me. So, you know, so I'm just like in it and praying and hoping that I'll find a good doctor that will help me for my GFR to go up.
Thank you for sharing your story. And I'm going to come back to you in just a minute because I think I want to hear more about your interest in participating in clinical trials. But first, I want to go to our other patient panelist, Mr. Holmes. So Mr. Dan Holmes is on the Space Coast of Florida, and he's agreed to join us as well. And so, Mr. Holmes, would you tell us very briefly your kidney story?
How you guys doing? Thanks for having me. Yes, my name is Dan Holmes. I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. I live now in the Space Coast of Florida. I was diagnosed with membranous nephropathy this time last year, coming up on my 1-year anniversary. I presented with nephrotic syndrome to the VA. I am a VA patient, or was a VA patient. I had all types of issues that I didn't know what was happening. And when we went to the emergency room, they found that I had was spilling a significant amount, 12,000 milligrams of protein in my urine. Told me I had nephrotic syndrome, basically said, hey, we're going to send you to a consult with nephrology and just take it from there and have a good day. So it was really a shocker for me, learning about chronic kidney disease, learning about my particular nephrotic syndrome, what the different flavors of nephrotic syndrome consisted of. We ended up a biopsy, which confirmed the membranous nephropathy. And my diagnosis is a little crazy because it's secondary membranous nephropathy, because I do not have the PLAR2 or whatever they call it antibody. but they don't know what it's secondary to. So I'm being treated as if it's primary. Have never been offered a clinical trial, have never, you know, I would love to get into clinical trials, but it's been a difficult road. But there's always light at the end of the tunnel. That's my story.
So thank you for sharing your story. And, you know, when we talked on the phone the other day, you made it very clear that, you know, if you could find a clinical trial, you would participate. But there's this barrier that all the trials that you've heard about you've been excluded from because your label is having secondary disease. And we can talk more about that, but I want to turn to Ms. Owusu and ask you, Ms. Owusu, would you be willing to participate in the clinical trial if you found one that you would be eligible for? And what barriers have you had in trying to find the clinical trial?
Oh yeah, I would love to. I would love to. Anything that would help me, like I said, get the GFR up, or anything that, even if it doesn't help me, at least it could help somebody else. Because like when you talk to people, people don't know about FSGS. So yes, I would love to. And it's so hard to find trials because the way I found out about Neptune is through Facebook. So I think there should be more education out there for people to know. Because the lady, Dr. Cruz, that just spoke, I mean, I didn't know a lot of things, but I learned a lot today. So, you know, it's good to, yeah. Education is really important. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So I want to open it up to a broader discussion with our panel. And my first question is for Dr. Cruz. So Dr. Cruz, in your presentation, you really highlighted the fact that kidney disease is underfunded compared to cancer and cardiovascular disease. And considering the fact that kidney disease disproportionately affects communities of color, one of the issues in and of itself is we don't have enough clinical trials. You know, we have 2 patients here who haven't been able to find trials that they're eligible for. Why is there's such a vast difference in funding for kidney disease compared to cancer and cardiovascular disease? Is it just kidney disease isn't sexy enough, or is the kidney community not lobbying enough? What do you think are the reasons why kidney disease is underfunded?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Dr. Tucker. I don't know the single answer. I think you highlighted some of them. I think that when we look at things like cancer, for example, and the funding that goes into funding cancer, and cancer, of course, is a leading cause of death, and certainly don't want to disparage the funding that's provided for cancer. But a lot of that really did start off with really kind of tugging at the heartstrings of the public. A lot of focus was on the effects of cancer on children, and there became a lot of, this is dating back several decades ago, a lot of really kind of advocacy around addressing cancer, and that led to the pouring in of tons of money, both at a federal level and also from private nonprofit sort of organizations that also contributed as well. And we've seen that also as well recently with Alzheimer's disease as well. There's been a lot of focus there. We haven't seen that yet in kidney disease, and I think it really does beg the question of sort of what we can do to advocate for that type of funding. But certainly there is this tremendous funding gap. I'd be interested to hear if others have thoughts on what we can do.
Well, thank you. I think that advocacy of patients is very important, and getting patient voices out there. And so I think that's why it's so great that we have 2 patients here today who are speaking personally to kidney disease, how it has affected them, and their willingness to participate in trials. Dr. Gillespie, I have a question I want to ask you about.
Dr. Tucker, before you move on, I think
Yes.
Mr. Fowler has his hand up. I think he can maybe add to the question that you just asked.
It's
Great,
actually,
go ahead, Mr. Fowler.
Yeah, Dr. Tucker, it's actually a question for Dr. Cruz. And I guess the question I have you considered having this conversation you're having today with the greater pharmaceutical industry that's invested in kidney disease? so that these issues are known at a much more senior level and could be acted upon. So I'm just curious if that's happened or if there'd be willingness to do that.
And thank you for that. So, and are you saying the greater conversation about funding or about enhancing participation?
Yeah, I probably enhancing participation, because I think I think that, yes.
Yeah, I think the participation piece, I personally have not, done, this sort of presentation to like broader pharmaceutical groups, but certainly I would be willing to. But yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Dr. Gillespie, I was struck when you showed some of the major clinical trials and the low participation of people of color in them. The big story over the last couple of years has been the diabetes trials, DAPA-CKD and Credence, and the participation of particularly Black patients was only, I think, about 5%, if I remember correctly, in Credence. How are other racially and ethnically diverse countries, for example, the UK, doing with respect to having broad representation? And are there lessons, if they're doing better than we are there lessons that we can learn from those other countries? And the second question is, can we assume that that Black patients in the UK or Afro-Brazilian patients are the same as African-American patients in the United States with respect to how they respond to medications or therapeutics?
So great question. I think the quick answer to the second question is no. We don't know that. And, a lot for clinical trials, race is self-reported. So what the patient is telling us, we have to go with. In the APO1 FSGS trials, we're doing genetic screening to confirm, but confirming African or Caribbean registry is all up to the patient telling us. With regard to your first question, I'm not aware of, I've never seen published data on the different racial breakdown per country. So, in the Bliss paper, and you can see the breakdown of race and then the breakdown of country, and 50% of those countries were Asian countries. So not a surprise that there were more Asians there. But when you try to understand where the proportion of the 13% of Black patients were coming from, were they coming from the US? Were they coming from other areas? That's not published. Now, the sponsor probably has that data just from, the CRFs, but it typically doesn't get published. So when I get asked to participate, to work with a sponsor on a clinical trial, and we're told, these FSGS APO1 studies, every patient, 100% of the patients have to have African or Caribbean registry. I've got 3 sets of slides that look at nephrology investigators, and what city they're in, and in those cities, what percent are African American based on the US census data. So again, we can try to plan really well, but then we're still have to address the barriers that Dr. Cruz mentioned, and it's not going to be the typical just wait for the patient to come to the nephrologist and offer them a trial. We have to be at the churches. We have to be at community, the YMCAs and everywhere else that we can touch patients and talk to patients directly. And again, I like Dr. Cruz, how you moved away from the word of distress and talked about fear. And I really hope that education can overcome fear. But this idea of, patients want to talk to physicians who look like them. Another anecdote, my cousin, 41 years old, has IgA nephropathy, and I sent him to a protocol that I designed to a colleague in New York where he lives, and he declined the trial. So I felt like a failure. And he said, if you had sent me to a Filipino nephrologist who treats IgA, then I would have been more inclined to participate. I said, wow, it is very personal, and there's culture involved, and we just have to respect that. So, and to Ellen and Daniel, we want to help you find files. So the first thing in the link in the chat, and we can send this by email, the National Kidney Foundation has started a patient registry. And what that is something that you can go online and self-register. And now you become part of this database where we're asking you questions about your kidney disease, but there will be resource to say, if you've got this disease, think about this clinical trial. So I want you to know that the National Kidney Foundation has the first ever US-based registry of patients. It's called the Patient Network. And then the second thing is, in the beginning, we showed a slide of the kidney health, the gateway. And so again, if we should share that link with you, because there's a wonderful trial finder. And I'm not a kidney patient, but I have played with this. And you plug in your zip code, your kidney disease. If you know your creatinine and your proteinuria, you hit send, and it will tell you 5 miles away at Duke, they're doing a trial on my disease. 10 miles at UNC. So please look at those resources. We're going to find you a trial. And if it's not, there's a lot of research. There's interventional trials where we give drug, but there's also research that looks at changes in how the diet that Dr. Cruz mentioned, and at the patient registry, that is going to be gathering data on patients to inform future research.
So as our time is winding down, but there are some great questions that are coming in the chat that I'll ask Tia. And some of them are directed specifically to Ms. Owusu and Mr. Holmes. And I think it'll be great to have their voices heard on these questions.
Oh, so I think one point before we move to the questions that Kristen Hood had brought up was that, of the, more than 20% of African American, or 20% of Americans living more than 60 miles from a trial center. And so again, reiterating the points that Dr. Cruz made of, the child care issue, the cost of travel, and those needing to be included into trial design. And then the question of telehealth being offered. And I think the clinical trials are starting to think and incorporate more of that so that we can reach a broader base. So I think that's very important points that have been made in the chat for those of you that can't see that. I think the other questions that have come up that we wanted to ask Ms. Owusu and Mr. Holmes is, one, if you were given a chance to see a physician, would you prefer to see someone who looked like you, or what are you looking for in that trust to build that relationship to someone who's going to care for you? And if you could start, Ms. Owusu, if you could start answering that one first.
Honestly, for me, it doesn't matter what race the doctor is. I like to research about the doctor, know if he's, if he has done it before, because of my past experience. But honestly, I'm just looking for any good doctor out there that can help me. Doesn't matter who you are.
And Mr. Holmes, how about you? Do you have a preference? Do you feel more comfortable with a certain person?
No, not at all. I don't have a preference. I don't care who you are, just as long as you're as motivated as me to help me. I'm as motivated to help myself. I should not be more motivated than my doctor that's getting paid to help me. And a lot of times I feel like I am more motivated to help myself than my doctors are to help me. I don't care what you look like. I don't care what you sound like. It doesn't matter to me. It really is important to having the technical acumen to be able to say, hey, look, you have a very unique kidney spilling or protein spilling kidney disease. And I want to dive into this as far as we possibly can. So that way we don't look for a kidney transplant for you, or that you don't end up on dialysis. The end stage is not the goal. The goal is to save the kidney that you currently have. And how can we do that? And what resources are available throughout the entire world that we can find, research, whatever, however it takes. I mean, I've never even been offered, get on a plane and fly somewhere. I'll do what I have to do to save the kidney I currently have. But without being given the opportunity, you're left stuck here just trying to figure it out yourself.
And I think, thank you both for sharing. I think that's very important to hear, and also speaks to the point Dr. Cruz made about health literacy and understanding your disease and having someone there to explain it to you, understand what you explain, or what you are understanding of it, which sometimes I think is easier said than done. And I think that's where Dr. Cruz's research is very helpful, because each patient is different and we need to understand that and be able to communicate the best to them to tell you all of those things and tell you what we know and what we don't know to best help you. So thank you for sharing that. I think another question along those lines is, what is your impact or what is your opinion about the clinical trials in general? And then does your family weigh into that? And I think Ms. Owusu, if you could start, I know you started to answer that some on the chat.
Yeah, so some of my family members are not for it. They're like, they're gonna give you these medicines. It might get your kidneys worse than they are. And like my brother is for it. He's like, go for it, whatever you need to do. So honestly, I'm just listening to myself because at the end of the day, it's about me. So I'm just looking for, like I said, I'm looking for somebody out there that can save my kidneys. Yeah.
Mr. Holmes, did you want to add anything?
My family plays a role in my kidney care, of course. You know, and they're your support system. They're our closest support system. But again, without having opportunity, you eliminate that whole important aspect of the kidney research.
Great, thank you. So I just want to highlight one comment or two that I saw in the chat. One was from Tejas Patel, who talked about the pipeline and the fact that we need to increase the number of investigators and physicians of color, and that we haven't really come very far from where we were in the 1970s in terms of academic physicians and investigators. And if we're going to move the needle in terms of kidney investigation, that we need to increase the numbers in that realm as well. The other interesting point that I'll make regarding the question that was asked about, would you prefer a physician who looks like you? There was an interesting paper that was published recently looking at infant outcomes and showed interestingly that the outcomes of infants who were delivered by an obstetrician in which there was racial concordance were better than those in which there was not racial concordance. So just an interesting finding that was recently published. So I think we are at the hour. And so I want to stop here and first thank our panelists, our patients, Mr. Holmes and Ms. Owusu, for taking time out of their schedules and sharing their personal stories with us. And then I want to thank Dr. Cruz and Dr. Gillespie for sharing their knowledge, wisdom, and insight into this very important topic, and for the advocacy for trying to make sure that we have greater representation in clinical trials.